The doorbell rang at exactly 6 p.m. on Christmas Eve, and I opened it to find 15 complete strangers standing on my porch, each holding a small wrapped gift and wearing expressions of cautious hope. Behind them, snow was beginning to fall on the quiet suburban street where I'd lived alone for the past 3 years since my divorce. What they didn't know was that by tomorrow morning, my entire life would change in ways none of us could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, I was staring at another rejection email when my sister Carmen called to remind me about Thanksgiving dinner at her house. I was sitting in my cramped studio apartment above Henderson's Deli, where I'd been working part-time since the divorce settlement left me with almost nothing. The apartment smelled permanently of pastrami and rye bread, and the walls were so thin I could hear Mrs. Chen's television through the floor at all hours. "You're coming this year, right, Maya?" "The kids keep asking about Aunt Maya," Carmen said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of forced cheerfulness she'd adopted whenever she talked to me since Daniel left. I looked around my tiny space, taking in the secondhand furniture I'd bought from garage sales and the stack of unpaid bills on my makeshift desk. "I don't think so, Carmen. I'm working that day anyway." "Working on Thanksgiving? Maya, that's just sad. You can't keep isolating yourself like this. It's been 3 years since the divorce. You need to start living again." Living again, as if it were that simple. As if I could just decide to stop feeling like a complete failure at 38 years old. After 15 years of marriage, Daniel had left me for his 25-year-old assistant, taking our house, our savings, and apparently my entire sense of self-worth with him. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself, but how everyone seemed to expect me to just bounce back, to reinvent myself, to find some inspirational silver lining in having my entire life dismantled. "I'm fine where I am," I told Carmen, though we both knew it was a lie. "No, you're not fine. You're existing. There's a difference. When's the last time you did something that made you happy, something that mattered?" I couldn't answer that question because I honestly couldn't remember. Every day blended into the next: wake up, go to work at the deli, come home to my empty apartment, eat dinner alone while scrolling through social media posts of other people's seemingly perfect lives, go to bed, repeat. I'd become a ghost of myself, invisible and insignificant. After Carmen hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment and felt the familiar weight of loneliness settle over me like a heavy blanket. Outside my window, I could see into the apartments across the street, each one glowing with warm light and the suggestion of lives being lived fully. There was the young couple who always cooked together on weeknights, dancing around their kitchen while they prepared meals. The elderly man who read by his window every evening, his cat curled up on his lap. The family with 3 children whose silhouettes moved past their windows in the organized chaos of dinner-time routines. I envied all of them their connection, their purpose, their apparent contentment with ordinary moments that somehow added up to meaningful lives. When had I stopped being part of the world and started just observing it from the outside? November turned into December, and my isolation deepened. The deli was busier during the holiday season, which meant longer hours and more interaction with customers who were shopping for family gatherings I'd never be invited to attend. I watched them select fancy cheeses and imported olives for parties where they'd be surrounded by people who cared about them, and I felt the familiar ache of being fundamentally alone. Mrs. Rodriguez, who owned the deli, noticed my mood getting darker as Christmas approached. She was a kind woman in her 60s who'd immigrated from Guatemala 30 years ago and built the business from nothing. Despite the language barrier, she had an intuitive understanding of human nature that often left me feeling exposed and vulnerable. "Mija, you look so sad lately," she said one afternoon as I was restocking the refrigerated cases. "Christmas is supposed to be time for joy, for family." "I don't really have family to celebrate with," I said, focusing intently on arranging the imported cheeses to avoid meeting her eyes. "Everyone has someone, you just have to look harder sometimes." Her words stayed with me as I walked home that evening through streets decorated with twinkling lights and cheerful holiday displays. Every window seemed to frame scenes of connection and belonging that felt as foreign to me as if I were looking at pictures from another planet. I'd become so accustomed to being alone that I'd forgotten how to be anything else. That night, lying in bed and listening to the couple upstairs argue about whose family to visit for Christmas, I made a decision that surprised even me. I was going to have Christmas dinner, and I was going to invite people to share it with me. Not family or friends, because I'd somehow managed to lose most of those connections during my marriage and its aftermath. I was going to invite strangers. The idea felt both terrifying and liberating. If I was going to be alone anyway, at least I could be alone with purpose. I could create something meaningful, even if it was just for one day. I could remember what it felt like to matter to someone, even if those someones were people I'd never met before. I spent the next 2 weeks planning obsessively, partly because I wanted everything to be perfect, and partly because the planning gave me something to focus on besides my own loneliness. I researched homeless shelters, contacted local community centers, and posted on neighborhood social media groups. I created simple flyers and left them at the library, the laundromat, and the community bulletin board at the grocery store. Christmas dinner for anyone who needs company, the flyers read. December 24th, 6 p.m., no one should spend Christmas alone, all are welcome. The responses were immediate and heartwarming. A woman named Sarah contacted me through Facebook, explaining that she was new to the city and didn't know anyone. An elderly man named Frank called the number I'd listed, his voice shaky as he explained that his wife had passed away 6 months ago, and he couldn't bear the thought of spending Christmas alone in their empty house. A young mother named Keisha reached out, saying she was working double shifts to support her kids and had no family nearby to celebrate with. One by one, people emerged from their own isolation to accept my invitation. Each response felt like a small miracle, proof that loneliness was more universal than I'd realized, and that sometimes all it takes is someone willing to make the first move toward connection. As Christmas Eve approached, I threw myself into preparation with an energy I hadn't felt in years. I borrowed folding tables and chairs from Carmen, who was both skeptical and impressed by my sudden burst of initiative. I cleaned my apartment obsessively, bought a small Christmas tree from the lot down the street, and spent my entire paycheck on ingredients for a feast that would feed 15 people. The cooking became a meditation, a way of channeling all my accumulated loneliness into something nourishing and generous. I made 3 different kinds of stuffing because I didn't know what people would prefer. I prepared both turkey and ham, along with roasted vegetables, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and 3 different desserts. Every dish was an act of hope, a bet that this gathering would somehow transform all of us into something more than the sum of our individual loneliness. Carmen came by that afternoon to drop off extra serving dishes, shaking her head at the chaos of my tiny kitchen. Maya, this is either the most beautiful thing you've ever done, or a complete disaster waiting to happen. 15 strangers. In this tiny apartment, what if they're weird? What if they don't get along? What if someone steals something? Her concerns were valid, but I was past the point of reasonable caution. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was doing something that mattered, something that justified my existence beyond merely surviving from one day to the next. Then they steal something, I said, stirring the gravy with probably unnecessary vigor. At least we'll all have spent Christmas together instead of alone. You're either very brave or very foolish, Carmen said, but she was smiling as she said it. Maybe I was both. Maybe sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones that feel slightly insane, the ones that require us to leap without knowing where we'll land. As I put the finishing touches on the meal and set the table with mismatched plates and silverware, I felt more alive than I had in years. At 5:45, 15 minutes before people were supposed to arrive, I stood in my tiny apartment surrounded by enough food for a small army and wondered what I'd gotten myself into. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman I barely recognized, someone who looked purposeful and determined instead of defeated and invisible. My hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and I was wearing the one nice dress I'd kept after the divorce, a deep green velvet that Daniel had always said made my eyes look brighter. For once I wasn't thinking about Daniel or the life I'd lost or all the ways I'd failed to live up to my own expectations. I was thinking about the 15 people who would soon walk through my door, each carrying their own stories of struggle and survival, and how for one evening we would all belong somewhere together. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 p.m., and when I opened the door to see all 15 of my guests standing together on the porch, I felt something shift inside my chest. They'd found each other somehow, these strangers who'd responded to my invitation, and they'd arrived as a group rather than individually. Sarah, the newcomer to the city, was standing next to Frank, the widower, and they were both talking quietly with Keisha, the single mother who'd brought her 2 young children. There was Miguel, a college student whose family lived too far away for him to afford a trip home. Janet, a nurse who'd volunteered to work Christmas Day, so her colleagues could be with their families. Robert, a veteran who'd been living in his car since losing his job 3 months ago. Maria, an elderly woman whose adult children lived across the country and couldn't visit this year. Each face told a story of displacement, of circumstances that had left them outside the traditional circles of holiday celebration. But standing together on my porch, holding small wrapped gifts and wearing expressions of nervous excitement, they looked like what they were.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
People who'd chosen hope over isolation, community over solitude. "Welcome," I said, stepping aside to let them enter my small apartment. "I'm so glad you're all here." The evening that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined. The conversation flowed as easily as if we'd known each other for years. Frank and Miguel discovered they were both passionate about baseball and spent an hour discussing statistics and memorable games. Sarah and Janet bonded over their experiences as transplants to the city, sharing recommendations for everything from doctors to grocery stores. The children, Keisha's daughter Amara and son Deshaun, immediately adopted Robert as their honorary grandfather, and he seemed to come alive under their attention, telling stories about his travels during his military service, and teaching them card tricks he'd learned overseas. We ate until we couldn't move, talking and laughing as snow continued to fall outside the windows. The apartment that had felt cramped and inadequate when I lived in it alone somehow expanded to accommodate all of us comfortably. We passed dishes around the table, shared stories about our worst Christmas gifts and our favorite holiday traditions, and gradually began to weave ourselves into the fabric of each other's lives. After dinner, we exchanged the small gifts people had brought. Nothing expensive or elaborate, just thoughtful tokens of appreciation for the invitation and the company. Sarah had made handmade cards for everyone. Frank brought chocolate from the fancy shop downtown. Keisha's children had drawn pictures of Christmas trees and Santa Claus that we taped to my refrigerator like precious artwork. I received 15 small gifts that evening, but the real gift was watching a room full of strangers transform into a temporary family. By the time people started to leave around 10 p.m., we were exchanging phone numbers and making plans to stay in touch. Frank invited everyone to his house for New Year's Eve. Sarah suggested starting a monthly potluck dinner group. Keisha asked if anyone wanted to help her kids with a school project next week. After the last guest left, I stood in my apartment surrounded by dirty dishes and the lingering warmth of conversation and laughter. The space felt different somehow, larger and more significant, as if it had been blessed by the presence of people who'd chosen to trust a stranger's invitation to share Christmas together. I was washing dishes and thinking about what an unexpected success the evening had been when I heard a soft knock at my door. It was nearly midnight, and I couldn't imagine who would be visiting at such a late hour. When I looked through the peephole, I saw a young woman I didn't recognize, probably in her early 20s, holding what appeared to be a large package. "Are you Maya?" she asked when I opened the door cautiously. "The woman who invited strangers to Christmas dinner." "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" "My name is Elena Rodriguez. Mrs. Rodriguez from the deli is my grandmother. She told me what you did tonight, and I wanted to bring you something." She held out the package, which I could now see was a beautifully wrapped box with an elaborate red ribbon. "It's from my whole family. Abuela said you needed to know that your kindness didn't go unnoticed." I accepted the gift, touched by the unexpected gesture, but not quite understanding its significance. "That's very sweet, but you really didn't need to bring anything. Tonight was its own reward." Elena smiled mysteriously. "Open it tomorrow morning, and Maya, check your social media. What you did tonight is spreading." She left before I could ask what she meant, disappearing into the snowy night and leaving me standing in my doorway with questions and a growing sense that something important was happening that I didn't fully understand yet. I set the package on my kitchen counter and decided to follow Elena's instructions to wait until morning to open it. But I couldn't resist checking my social media accounts before going to bed. What I found there made me sit down heavily in my kitchen chair, staring at my phone screen in disbelief. The simple Facebook post I'd made about hosting Christmas dinner for strangers had been shared hundreds of times. Comments were pouring in from people all over the world, sharing their own stories of loneliness during the holidays, and praising what one person called a beautiful example of human kindness in action. Someone had found the photos Sarah had taken during dinner, and shared them online. They showed our mismatched group gathered around my small table, faces glowing with laughter and genuine joy. The images captured something I hadn't fully appreciated while living it: the profound beauty of strangers choosing to trust each other with their vulnerability and their hope for connection. The comments kept coming as I scrolled through them. A woman in Australia wrote about how my story had inspired her to volunteer at a homeless shelter on Boxing Day. A man in Germany shared that he'd been contemplating spending Christmas alone, but had decided to call his estranged brother instead. A teenager in Canada said, "My post had given her hope that kindness still existed in the world." I fell asleep that night with my phone still in my hand, watching notifications continue to accumulate as my simple Christmas dinner somehow became a viral symbol of the power of human connection. I didn't yet understand how dramatically my life was about to change, or that the 15 strangers I'd welcomed into my home had somehow opened a door to connections that would span the globe. But I slept more peacefully than I had in years, surrounded by the lingering evidence of an evening that had reminded me who I was capable of being, when I stopped hiding from the world and started engaging with it instead. Tomorrow would bring revelations I never could have imagined, but tonight I was simply a woman who'd remembered what it felt like to matter to other people, and to create something meaningful from nothing more than an open heart and a willingness to take a risk on human kindness. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of crystalline brightness that makes everything look like it belongs on a postcard. I woke up naturally around 7, which was unusual for me since I typically needed 3 alarms to drag myself out of bed. But this morning felt different. The apartment was filled with a quality of light I'd never noticed before, and the silence had a peaceful weight to it, rather than the oppressive emptiness I'd grown accustomed to. I made coffee and stood at my kitchen window, looking down at the street below where fresh snow had transformed the familiar neighborhood into something magical and new. The package Elena had brought sat on my counter, still wrapped in its elegant red ribbon, waiting for me to discover whatever surprise Mrs. Rodriguez's family had prepared. My phone had been buzzing intermittently since dawn, notifications continuing to accumulate from the viral spread of my Christmas dinner story. I'd turned off the sound around midnight, but the screen kept lighting up with messages, comments, and friend requests from people around the world who'd somehow found my small act of holiday hospitality worth celebrating. Before opening Elena's gift, I decided to check the extent of the online response. What I found left me speechless. The original Facebook post had been shared over 10,000 times overnight. The photos Sarah had taken were being reposted on Instagram, Twitter, and platforms I'd never even heard of. News websites had picked up the story, with headlines like "Woman's Christmas Dinner for Strangers Restores Faith in Humanity" and "Viral Holiday Kindness Spreads Global Joy." But it wasn't just the numbers that shocked me. It was the personal stories people were sharing in response. A grandmother in Japan wrote about how my story had inspired her to reach out to her neighbors, elderly people who'd been isolated since the pandemic. A college student in Brazil described organizing his own dinner for international students who couldn't afford to fly home for the holidays. A woman in London shared that she'd been planning to spend Christmas alone after her divorce, but had instead volunteered at a local shelter. The ripple effects were spreading far beyond anything I could have imagined when I'd simply decided I didn't want to be alone on Christmas. Somehow, my small gesture had given other people permission to step outside their own isolation and create connections they'd been craving but hadn't known how to initiate. My doorbell rang while I was still scrolling through messages, and I assumed it was probably Carmen coming to check on how the dinner had gone. Instead, I found a delivery person holding an enormous bouquet of flowers. "Maya Hartwell?" she asked, consulting her clipboard. "Yes, that's me. These are for you. There's also this." She handed me a card along with the flowers, which were the most beautiful arrangement I'd ever seen. White roses, red poinsettias, evergreen branches, and gold ribbons created a display that looked like something from a high-end florist, not the kind of thing anyone in my social circle could afford. The card read, "Thank you for reminding us what Christmas is really about. Your story gave us hope when we needed it most." From the Morrison family in Seattle. I'd never heard of the Morrison family, had no idea how they'd found my address, and couldn't fathom why strangers from across the country would send such an extravagant gift. But as I set the flowers on my small dining table, I felt the first stirring of something I couldn't quite name. Not just gratitude, but a sense that forces much larger than my understanding were beginning to move around me. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was another delivery person, this one carrying a large basket filled with gourmet foods, imported cheeses, specialty crackers, exotic jams, and chocolates that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than my humble kitchen. From the Chen family in Vancouver, the delivery note explained. Your kindness inspired our family to volunteer at the local food bank. We wanted to share some joy with you in return. I was still marveling at the basket when a third delivery arrived, then a fourth. By noon, my tiny apartment was overflowing with packages, flowers, gift baskets, and cards from people all over the world. Each delivery came with a note explaining how my Christmas dinner story had touched someone's life, inspired their own act of kindness, or given them hope during a difficult time. The gifts ranged from simple to extravagant. A hand-knitted scarf from a woman in Norway who wrote that she'd been making scarves for her local homeless shelter since reading my story. A box of homemade cookies from a teenager in Texas whose grandmother had taught her that the best gifts come from the kitchen and the heart. A set of beautiful ceramic bowls from a pottery artist in California who'd been moved by the image of strangers gathering around my mismatched table. But perhaps the most meaningful gift was a simple envelope containing a handwritten letter from a man named Thomas in Maine. His wife had died 2 years ago, he wrote, and he'd been contemplating ending his own life on Christmas Day because the loneliness had become unbearable. Reading about my dinner had reminded him that connection was still possible, that there were still people in the world willing to reach out to strangers. Instead of giving up, he'd called his estranged daughter and asked if they could try to rebuild their relationship. I sat on my couch, surrounded by packages and cards, crying tears that were equal parts overwhelming gratitude and complete bewilderment. How had my simple Christmas dinner turned into this? How had a story about 15 strangers sharing a meal become a global phenomenon that was apparently inspiring acts of kindness on multiple continents? My phone rang, interrupting my emotional spiral. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer it anyway. Is this Maya Hartwell? The voice was warm and professional, with a slight accent I couldn't place. Yes, this is Maya. My name is Dr. Sarah Pemberton, and I'm calling from the International Foundation for Community Development in Geneva. We've been following the response to your Christmas dinner story, and we'd like to discuss something with you if you have a moment. I looked around my gift-filled apartment, wondering if this day could possibly become any more surreal. I have a moment. Hartwell, what you did on Christmas Eve represents exactly the kind of grassroots community building that our foundation exists to support and amplify. We've been tracking the ripple effects of your story across social media, and we've documented over 300 separate acts of kindness that people have attributed directly to your inspiration. I felt dizzy. 300. And that's just what we've been able to verify through public posts and direct communications. The actual number is likely much higher. Your simple act of hospitality has created what we call a kindness cascade, where one person's generosity inspires exponential acts of giving and connection. Dr. Pemberton went on to explain that their foundation studied and supported exactly these kinds of organic community building initiatives. They were particularly interested in how individual actions could spark broader social movements, and my Christmas dinner had become a textbook example of what they called viral altruism. We'd like to offer you something, she continued. Our foundation provides grants to individuals whose actions demonstrate the potential to create lasting positive change in their communities. Based on what you've accomplished in just 24 hours, we'd like to offer you a fellowship that would allow you to expand your work in community building. The number she mentioned made me sit down heavily on my couch. It was more money than I'd made in the past 3 years combined, enough to change my life completely and pursue community work as a full-time calling rather than a one-time holiday gesture. Dr. Pemberton, I think there's been some mistake. I'm not a community organizer or a social worker. I'm a divorced woman who works part-time at a deli and lives in a tiny apartment. I invited some strangers to dinner because I was lonely. That's all. Miss Hartwell, some of the most effective community builders in history started exactly where you are. They saw a need, took action to address it, and discovered they had a gift for bringing people together. The difference between someone who has one successful event and someone who changes communities is often just the opportunity and resources to continue their work. After Dr. Pemberton hung up, promising to send detailed information about the fellowship, I sat in my apartment, trying to process what felt like a complete reshaping of my reality. 24 hours ago, I'd been Maya the invisible divorce, Maya the deli worker, Maya the woman who'd somehow lost herself so completely that she couldn't remember who she used to be. But the woman who'd invited 15 strangers to dinner, who'd sparked a global conversation about kindness and connection, who was apparently being offered opportunities that could transform her entire life trajectory. That woman felt like someone I was only beginning to meet. Elena's package still sat unopened on my counter, and I realized I'd been unconsciously avoiding it, because some part of me understood that whatever was inside would be another piece of this puzzle I was only beginning to understand. I picked up the beautifully wrapped box and carefully untied the red ribbon. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a leather-bound journal with my name embossed in gold on the cover. The first page contained a handwritten note from Mrs. Rodriguez in her careful formal handwriting. Mija, my family has been watching you for 3 years, seeing how you carry sadness, but also seeing the good heart you try to hide. What you did for Christmas, this is who you really are. Not the broken woman who thinks she has nothing to offer. You are someone who builds bridges between people, someone who creates home where there was none before. This journal is for you to write your new story, the one where you remember your power to change the world, one person at a time. We believe in who you are becoming. The rest of the journal was blank, waiting for me to fill it with whatever came next. But tucked into the back cover was something that made my hands shake as I pulled it out, a check from Rodriguez Family Enterprises for $50,000, with a note that read seed money for whatever community work calls to your heart. I had to read the check 3 times before the number sank in. Mrs. Rodriguez, who I'd assumed was just a kind woman running a small neighborhood deli, had apparently been watching me with the eyes of someone who recognized potential I'd been too broken to see in myself. The money, combined with the fellowship Dr. Pemberton had offered, represented more financial security than I'd had since before my divorce. But more than the money, it was the recognition that shattered something inside me that had been carefully constructed over 3 years of believing I was worthless. Mrs. Rodriguez had seen through my damaged exterior to the woman I'd been before Daniel left, before I'd allowed his abandonment to convince me that I had nothing valuable to offer the world. My phone rang again, and this time it was Carmen, her voice breathless with excitement. Maya, what did you do? I've been getting calls all morning from reporters asking about your Christmas dinner. There's a news van parked outside my house, and someone from Good Morning America wants to interview you. The woman said, your story is trending nationally. I looked around my apartment, which had been transformed from a sparse lonely space into something that looked like the aftermath of the world's most generous holiday explosion. Gifts and flowers covered every surface. Cards and letters were stacked in piles on my kitchen table, and my phone continued to buzz with messages from strangers whose lives had somehow been touched by my simple desire not to spend Christmas alone. Carmen, I think I might have accidentally started something I don't understand. Started something. Maya, you've created a movement. Do you know that there are copycat Christmas dinners happening in 12 different countries today? People are posting photos of their own stranger dinners and using hashtags with your name. You've become famous for being kind. The phrase felt surreal, like something that happened to other people, not to divorced deli workers, who'd spent 3 years convinced they were invisible and unimportant. Over the next few hours, the deliveries continued. A care package from a women's shelter in Detroit, whose residents had been inspired to organize their own community dinner. A hand-carved wooden bowl from an artist in Oregon, who'd read my story and wanted to contribute something beautiful to whatever came next. A check from a businessman in New York, who'd been moved by the idea of supporting grassroots kindness initiatives. Each gift came with a story. A letter from someone whose life had been changed by reading about my dinner. A photo of another gathering, inspired by mine. A description of a volunteer project someone had started because my story had reminded them that individual actions could create ripple effects beyond their imagination. By evening, I'd received gifts from all 7 continents, including a package from a research station in Antarctica, where scientists had organized their own version of a stranger dinner in honor of my story. The global response was so overwhelming that I'd stopped trying to count or catalog everything. Instead, I'd started reading the letters and cards, each one a reminder that loneliness and the desire for connection were universal human experiences that transcended geography, culture, and circumstance. As darkness fell, I realized I needed to make a decision about Dr. Pemberton's fellowship offer. The opportunity represented everything I'd lost in my divorce, and more financial security, meaningful work, recognition of my worth as a person capable of making a difference. But accepting it would mean acknowledging that I was no longer the broken woman who'd invited strangers to dinner out of desperation. It would mean stepping into a version of myself I'd never imagined possible. I opened Mrs. Rodriguez's journal and began to write, "My name is Maya Hartwell. And yesterday, I thought I knew who I was. I was the woman who lost everything in a divorce and spent 3 years shrinking into invisible irrelevance. I was the failure who couldn't even maintain the most basic human connections. I was the cautionary tale about what happens when you build your entire identity around someone else's love and then lose it. But today I received gifts from strangers on 6 continents who say my story gave them hope. Today I was offered opportunities that could change my life completely. Today I discovered that Mrs. Rodriguez, who I thought was just a kind deli owner, is actually someone who's been investing in my potential for 3 years, waiting for me to remember who I am. The woman who invited 15 strangers to Christmas dinner isn't someone I was pretending to be. She's who I've always been underneath the layers of shame and self-doubt that I wrapped around myself after Daniel left. She's the person who organized community fundraisers in college, who volunteered at homeless shelters during graduate school, who used to believe that small actions could create meaningful change. I don't know what comes next, but I know that whatever it is, it starts with accepting that I'm not broken. I'm not worthless. I'm not invisible. I'm someone who creates connection where there was isolation, who builds community from nothing more than an open heart and a willingness to take risks on human kindness. Tomorrow, I'm going to call Dr. Pemberton and accept her fellowship. Tomorrow, I'm going to start planning whatever comes after my accidental moment of viral fame. Tomorrow, I'm going to begin the work of becoming the person I never knew I was capable of being. But tonight, I'm going to sit in my apartment, surrounded by gifts from strangers who believed in me before I believed in myself, and I'm going to remember what it feels like to matter to the world. As I closed the journal and prepared for bed, I realized that somewhere in the course of this impossible day, I'd stopped thinking of myself as Maya the failure and started becoming Maya, the bridge builder, Maya the community creator, Maya the woman who'd accidentally discovered her calling by following her loneliness toward connection instead of away from it. The 15 strangers who'd shared my Christmas dinner had given me more than company for one evening. They'd given me back my sense of purpose, my recognition of my own worth, and my understanding that the things I'd thought made me powerless, my loneliness, my vulnerability, my desperate desire for human connection, were actually the sources of my greatest strength. Tomorrow would bring decisions about how to use this unexpected platform, how to channel the global response into sustainable change, how to honor the trust that thousands of strangers had placed in my story. But tonight, I was simply a woman who'd learned that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the smallest acts of courage, and that the person you think you are might be just the prologue to the person you're capable of becoming. The morning of December 27th brought an unexpected visitor to my door. I'd spent the previous day fielding interview requests from journalists around the world, trying to understand how my simple Christmas dinner had evolved into what one reporter called a global phenomenon of grassroots compassion. The constant attention was simultaneously thrilling and overwhelming, but nothing could have prepared me for the conversation I was about to have. When I opened the door, I found a man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his smile had the practiced quality of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through charm and persistence. "Miss Hartwell, my name is Richard Blackwood, and I represent the Meridian Group. We're a consulting firm that specializes in monetizing viral social media phenomena. I'd like to discuss some very lucrative opportunities with you." I invited him in, though something about his demeanor made me uncomfortable. He looked around my gift-filled apartment with the calculating gaze of someone appraising merchandise, taking note of the expensive flower arrangements and packages that continued to arrive daily from supporters around the world. "Impressive," he said, settling into my secondhand armchair as if he owned it. "You've managed to create quite a brand around this charity dinner concept. Very smart positioning, very authentic feeling. Our research indicates you could easily monetize this into a 7-figure enterprise within 6 months." The word monetize hit me like cold water. "I'm sorry, what exactly are you suggesting?" Blackwood opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. "We represent several high-profile clients who've successfully transitioned from viral fame to sustainable business models. The key is striking while the iron is hot, capitalizing on public interest before it moves on to the next trending story." He spread papers across my coffee table, each one covered with charts, projections, and financial forecasts that made my head spin. "We're talking about book deals, speaking engagements, branded merchandise, partnerships with major corporations looking to associate with your message of community and kindness. Conservative estimates suggest you could earn $2 million in the first year alone." I stared at the documents, feeling something cold and unpleasant settling in my stomach. "You want me to turn my Christmas dinner into a business? I want to help you transform an inspiring moment into a sustainable platform for change. Think about it, Miss Hartwell. Right now you're inspiring people for free. Wouldn't it be more effective if you had the resources to scale your impact? Professional marketing, nationwide events, corporate sponsorships that could fund community dinners in hundreds of cities." The logic was seductive, but something about it felt fundamentally wrong. As Blackwood continued his pitch, describing merchandise lines and corporate partnerships, I found myself thinking about the handwritten letters I'd received from strangers whose lives had been touched by my story. None of them had mentioned wanting to buy anything from me. They'd simply wanted to share how my act of vulnerability and openness had given them permission to reach out, to connect, to remember their own capacity for kindness. What would this involve exactly? I asked, though I was already beginning to understand that whatever he was proposing would transform me from someone who'd accidentally inspired people into someone who was professionally inspiring people, and the difference felt crucial. "Standard influencer package," Blackwood said smoothly. "Social media management, brand partnerships, sponsored content, speaking tours. We'd handle all the business details. You just need to be the face of the brand. Show up, tell your story, promote the products and partnerships we develop around your message." He pulled out a contract that was intimidating in its thickness and complexity. "This is a standard representation agreement. Gives us exclusive rights to manage your public image and monetize your story across all platforms. 60-40 split in your favor, which is quite generous for someone without an established platform." I thought about Dr. Pemberton's fellowship offer, which had come with no strings attached except the expectation that I would use the resources to continue building genuine community connections. I thought about Mrs. Rodriguez's gift, given not because she expected anything in return but because she'd seen potential in me that I'd forgotten existed. "Mr. Blackwood, can I ask you something? Have you ever organized a community dinner? Have you ever invited strangers into your home because you couldn't bear to spend a holiday alone?" His smile faltered slightly. "I'm not in the event planning business, Miss Hartwell. I'm in the business of helping people maximize their opportunities when lightning strikes. What you did was wonderful, but wonderful doesn't pay bills or create lasting impact without proper business structure behind it. And what happens to the wonderful part when it becomes a business structure? Smart branding preserves the authentic emotional core while expanding reach and impact. Look at any successful nonprofit or social enterprise. They all had to professionalize their message to scale effectively. I found myself thinking about Frank, the widower who'd attended my dinner, and how his eyes had lit up when the children adopted him as their honorary grandfather. I thought about Robert, the veteran living in his car, and how he'd seemed to grow taller when Keisha asked for his advice about her son's homework troubles. The magic of that evening hadn't been about scale or reach or impact metrics. It had been about humans recognizing their fundamental need for each other and choosing to trust strangers with their vulnerability. I need to think about this, I told Blackwood, though I was already certain what my answer would be. Of course, but don't think too long. Viral fame has a short shelf life, and there are already copycat stories emerging. Someone in Portland organized a New Year's dinner for strangers and is getting significant media attention. If you don't move quickly to establish your brand in this space, someone else will. After he left, I sat surrounded by his contracts and projections, feeling like I'd just been offered the chance to sell something I didn't actually own. The story of my Christmas dinner belonged as much to Frank and Sarah and Keisha and the children as it did to me. It belonged to the thousands of strangers who'd reached out to share how it had touched their lives. Turning it into a brand would mean claiming ownership of something that had only been meaningful because it was freely given and freely shared. My phone rang, interrupting my troubled thoughts. The caller ID showed Carmen's number. "Maya, have you seen the news?" Her voice was tight with concern. "What news?" "Someone's claiming you stole their idea. There's a woman in Sacramento who says she's been organizing community dinners for years and that you copied her concept. She's all over social media, saying you're getting credit for work she's been doing for decades." I felt my stomach drop. "What woman? I've never heard of anyone in Sacramento. Her name is Linda Patterson. She runs something called Community Tables, and she's been posting videos claiming that your viral fame is built on appropriating her life's work. Some of her followers are getting pretty nasty about it online." I immediately went to my laptop and searched for Linda Patterson. What I found was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and tired eyes, standing in what appeared to be a community center kitchen, speaking directly to the camera with obvious frustration and hurt. "I've been organizing dinners for isolated community members for 12 years, she was saying. 12 years of building relationships, creating connections, helping people who have nowhere else to go during the holidays. And now this woman in Chicago does it once and becomes an international sensation, gets offered book deals and speaking engagements. Where were the cameras when I was serving Thanksgiving dinner to 40 homeless veterans last month?" The comments below her video were a mix of support for her work and anger directed at me. People were calling me a fraud, an opportunist, someone who'd stumbled into undeserved fame, while real community workers like Linda labored in obscurity. Some commenters were demanding that I acknowledge her prior work and share whatever financial benefits I'd received from the media attention. The accusations stung, but what hurt more was the underlying truth in Linda's complaint. I had stumbled into this attention accidentally, while she'd been doing similar work for years without recognition. The randomness of viral fame meant that identical actions could result in vastly different outcomes depending on timing, social media algorithms, and pure chance. I spent the next hour researching Linda Patterson's work, and what I found was genuinely impressive. Community Tables had served thousands of meals over the years, had created lasting friendships between participants, had even helped several homeless individuals find permanent housing and employment. Her work was more extensive, more systematic, and more impactful than my single Christmas dinner, yet it had received virtually no media attention. I called Carmen back. "I need Linda Patterson's contact information." "Maya, are you sure that's a good idea? Your lawyer would probably tell you not to engage directly with someone who's making public claims against you." "I don't have a lawyer, and this isn't about legal strategy. If I accidentally took credit for work she's been doing for years, I need to understand how to make that right." It took several hours to track down a phone number for Community Tables, and when I finally reached Linda Patterson, the conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd expected. Miss Hartwell, her voice was cautious but not hostile when I introduced myself. I wasn't sure you'd call directly. I saw your video, and I wanted to understand your perspective. If I've somehow taken credit for work you've been doing, I need to know how to acknowledge that properly. There was a long pause. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone defensive. Someone who'd deny any connection to what I've been doing. Someone who'd hired a publicist to manage this conversation. Her voice softened slightly. I've been doing this work for 12 years, Miss Hartwell. Not for recognition or fame, but because it needed doing. When your story went viral, I felt invisible all over again. Like all those years of work didn't matter, because I didn't happen to have the right social media presence when I started. I understood her frustration more deeply than she probably realized. Linda, can I ask you something? When you started Community Tables, were you coming from a place of personal need, or was it always about helping others? Personal need, she admitted. My husband died suddenly when I was 52. I found myself completely alone for the first time in my adult life. The community dinners started because I couldn't bear to eat dinner by myself every night, but I was too proud to admit that to my family. The similarity of our situations was striking, but what impressed me more was what Linda had built from her initial loneliness. While I'd had one successful dinner and stumbled into viral fame, she'd created a sustainable program that had been serving her community for over a decade. Linda, I want to propose something, but I need you to hear me out completely before you respond. I'm listening. I've been offered opportunities that I don't think I deserve, and that I'm not sure I want. Book deals, speaking engagements, consulting contracts that would turn my Christmas dinner into a brand. But what if instead of building something around my story, we focused on amplifying the work you've already been doing? What do you mean? What if we used whatever platform I've accidentally created to showcase Community Tables and help you expand your work? What if the interviews and media attention became opportunities to highlight effective community building that's already happening, rather than promoting my one-time event? The silence that followed was so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally Linda spoke, and her voice was thick with emotion. Why would you do that? This is your moment. Your opportunity to build something significant from what you started. Because what I started was one dinner. What you've built is a model for ongoing community connection that could be replicated in cities across the country. The attention I'm getting is an accident of timing and social media algorithms. The work you've done is the result of genuine commitment to serving others. Miss Hartwell, I don't know what to say. Say you'll let me help you get the recognition and resources your work deserves. Say you'll teach me how to do this kind of community building sustainably instead of just as a one-time gesture. When Linda agreed to meet with me the following week, I felt something shift inside my understanding of what success might look like. Richard Blackwood's offer had been about capitalizing on accidental fame. Dr. Pemberton's fellowship was about supporting genuine community work. But partnering with Linda represented something different, the opportunity to use unexpected attention to amplify work that deserved recognition, while learning from someone who'd been walking this path much longer than I had. That evening, I called Dr. Pemberton to discuss modifying the fellowship proposal to include support for Linda's existing work rather than just my future projects. I explained the situation and my belief that Community Tables represented exactly the kind of proven community building model that the foundation should be supporting. Miss Hartwell, this is quite unusual. Most people who receive our fellowships want to build their own programs rather than subordinate their work to someone else's existing project. I'm not subordinating my work to hers, Dr. Pemberton. I'm recognizing that she's already doing the work I thought I was inventing. Rather than duplicate her efforts, I'd like to help expand them and learn from her experience. This approach shows remarkable maturity and wisdom. Very few people who stumble into viral fame have the perspective to step back and ask who was already doing this work before they arrived on the scene. The conversation with Dr. Pemberton led to a restructured fellowship that would support both Linda's existing Community Tables program and my development as a community organizer under her mentorship. The financial resources would help expand Community Tables to additional cities while providing me with the training and experience I'd need to contribute meaningfully to the work. When I called Blackwood to decline his representation offer, his response was predictably dismissive. "Miss Hartwell, you're making a significant mistake. Viral fame is a limited resource, and you're choosing to waste it on charitable work that will never provide financial security or long-term career prospects. Mr. Blackwood, I think we have different definitions of waste. Giving away opportunities that could set you up for life, so you can help some unknown woman in Sacramento expand her charity work. That's not noble, it's naive. Maybe, but it feels right in a way that turning my Christmas dinner into a brand never did." After I hung up, I realized that declining Blackwood's offer wasn't just about rejecting commercialization of my story. It was about choosing to become someone who used unexpected opportunities to lift up others rather than just advancing my own interests. It was about recognizing that true community building meant acknowledging and supporting the work that was already happening, rather than assuming I needed to start from scratch. The next few days brought a different kind of media attention as word spread about my decision to highlight Linda Patterson's work rather than capitalizing on my own viral moment. Some reporters were puzzled by what they saw as a strategic mistake. Others framed it as an inspiring example of using fame responsibly. The comments on social media were predictably mixed, with some people praising my decision and others criticizing me for what they saw as false modesty or publicity stunt. But the response that mattered most came from the people who'd been touched by my original Christmas dinner story. Many wrote to express support for my decision to focus on sustainable community building rather than personal brand development. Several mentioned that my choice to highlight Linda's work had restored their faith in the authenticity of viral kindness stories. Frank, the widower who'd attended my Christmas dinner, called to tell me he'd looked up community tables and had volunteered to help serve at their New Year's dinner. Sarah, the newcomer to the city, had organized a group of other recent transplants to start their own monthly community meal program. Keisha had reached out to Linda directly to ask about starting a community tables chapter in her neighborhood. The ripple effects of my Christmas dinner were continuing to spread, but now they were connecting to established networks of community building, rather than just inspiring isolated acts of kindness. The collaboration with Linda was creating a bridge between viral inspiration and sustainable action, between momentary attention and long-term change. As January began, I prepared to travel to Sacramento to meet Linda in person and begin learning how to do this work properly. I packed Mrs. Rodriguez's journal, now filled with notes about community organizing strategies and reflections on the unexpected path my life had taken since Christmas Eve. The woman who'd invited 15 strangers to dinner out of loneliness was evolving into someone who understood that true community building required humility, collaboration, and the wisdom to recognize when others had already discovered the solutions you thought you were seeking. The viral fame had been accidental, but what I chose to do with it was becoming the foundation of a purpose I'd never known I was searching for. The greatest gift of my Christmas dinner hadn't been the global attention or the financial opportunities it had generated. It had been the discovery that my deepest personal needs, for connection, for purpose, for meaning, were actually shared by millions of other people who were also searching for ways to build authentic community in an increasingly isolated world. Working with Linda wouldn't make me famous or wealthy, but it would make me useful in a way that felt sustainable and genuine. And after 3 years of feeling invisible and worthless, becoming useful to something larger than myself was the kind of success I'd never thought to hope for but had somehow found anyway. 6 months later, I stood in the community center in Sacramento, watching Linda Patterson coordinate the preparation for Community Table's largest dinner event yet. The space buzzed with the organized chaos of 50 volunteers working together to serve 300 guests, and I felt a deep satisfaction watching something I'd helped grow from Linda's decade of quiet dedication into a regional model for community connection. The fellowship from Dr. Pemberton's foundation had exceeded every expectation. Rather than just supporting my individual development, it had funded the expansion of Community Tables into 8 cities across California and Nevada. Each new location was run by local coordinators who'd been trained in Linda's methodology but adapted to serve the specific needs of their communities. I'd spent the past months traveling between these sites, learning not just how to organize community dinners but how to build sustainable networks of support that extended far beyond single events. In Fresno, Community Tables had evolved into a job training program for unemployed adults. In Las Vegas, it had become a weekly gathering for elderly residents of assisted living facilities who rarely had visitors. In Oakland, it had transformed into a mentorship program connecting immigrant families with established community members. "Maya, can you check on the registration table?" Linda called from across the kitchen. "We're expecting some VIP guests tonight, and I want to make sure everything's running smoothly." The VIP guests she was referring to were representatives from the National Community Development Institute, who'd come to evaluate community tables for potential nationwide replication. The success of our California expansion had attracted attention from organizations looking for proven models of grassroots community building that could be scaled across the country. As I walked toward the registration area, I passed tables where volunteers were setting up name tags and welcome packets. Among them, I recognized several faces from my original Christmas dinner. Frank had become one of Community Table's most dedicated volunteers, using his experience as a retired accountant to help manage the organization's finances. Sarah had started the Sacramento chapter's social media presence, sharing stories of connection that helped recruit both volunteers and guests. Even Keisha had driven up from Los Angeles with her children, who were now helping younger kids feel comfortable at their first community dinner. The continuity felt meaningful in a way I hadn't anticipated when I'd first reached out to Linda. The people who'd shared my Christmas table hadn't just been inspired to occasional acts of kindness, they'd become part of an ongoing community that extended far beyond what any of us could have created individually. Maya Hartwell, a voice behind me, belonged to Dr. Patricia Wells from the National Institute. She was a stern-looking woman in her 60s whose reputation for thorough evaluation had made several community organizations nervous about her visit. "Yes, Dr. Wells, welcome to Community Tables. I've been reviewing your fellowship reports with great interest. The growth metrics are impressive, but I'm more curious about sustainability. How do you ensure that these dinner programs continue to serve their communities after the initial excitement wears off?" It was exactly the question I'd hoped she would ask, because the answer demonstrated what I'd learned about the difference between viral inspiration and lasting change. "Dr. Wells, can I introduce you to some of our long-term participants? The best way to understand sustainability is to hear from people who've been part of Community Tables for years, not months." I led her to a corner table where Maria Santos was sitting with 3 other women, deep in conversation about their weekly book club that had grown out of their Community Tables connections. Maria had been attending Linda's dinners for 5 years, ever since her divorce left her isolated and struggling with depression. "Maria, could you tell Dr. Wells about your experience with Community Tables?" Maria looked up with the warm smile that had made her a natural mentor for newer participants. "Oh, it's changed everything for me. When I first came, I was so lonely I was talking to my cats more than to humans. Now I have this whole network of friends. We don't just see each other at dinners anymore. We help each other with grocery shopping, babysit each other's grandchildren, organize carpools to medical appointments." Dr. Wells took notes as Maria continued. "The dinners brought us together, but the real community happens between the dinners. Last month when I had surgery, women from this table organized meals for my whole recovery period. When Janet lost her job, we helped her practice interview skills and connected her with someone who worked at the company where she's now employed." This was what Linda had tried to explain to me during my first visit to Sacramento. Community Tables wasn't really about the dinners themselves. The shared meals were just a mechanism for creating the trust and familiarity that allowed deeper relationships to develop. The true measure of success wasn't how many people attended events, but how many people found lasting connections that improved their daily lives. "Dr. Wells, let me show you something else," I said, leading her toward the kitchen where the real work of Community Tables happened. Linda was training a new volunteer coordinator, a young woman named Jessica who'd attended her first Community Tables dinner 3 months ago as a guest. Now she was learning how to manage the complex logistics of feeding large groups while creating an atmosphere that felt intimate and welcoming rather than institutional. "The key is making sure every single person feels seen," Linda was explaining. "Not just fed, but recognized as an individual with something valuable to contribute. That's why we spend so much time on name tags, on seating arrangements that mix longtime participants with newcomers, on conversation starters that help people find common ground." Jessica nodded, taking notes on a clipboard. "What about people who are really shy or don't speak English well? That's where our regular volunteers become essential. People like Frank and Sarah who've been coming for months, they naturally become ambassadors who help newcomers feel included. And we always have volunteers who speak multiple languages, not just to translate but to help bridge cultural differences that might make people feel excluded. Dr. Wells was scribbling furiously in her notebook. This kind of detailed attention to inclusion and relationship building was exactly what distinguished effective community programs from well-intentioned efforts that failed to create lasting change. Miss Hartwell, can you walk me through the financial model? How do you fund this level of programming sustainably? The money conversation was one I dreaded initially, but Linda's approach had taught me that transparency about resources was essential for building trust with both participants and funders. We operate on a hybrid model, I explained. The fellowship provides core funding for coordination and training, but each local chapter raises about 60% of its operating budget through community partnerships. Local restaurants donate surplus food, grocery stores contribute ingredients, and participants contribute what they can, whether that's money, time, or skills. I showed her our budget breakdown, which Linda had insisted on making publicly available to build community trust. The key is that we're not trying to replace existing social services or become a charity that creates dependency. We're facilitating connections that help people support each other, which ultimately reduces everyone's isolation and increases everyone's resources. Dr. Wells spent the rest of the evening observing the dinner itself, and I watched her expression change as she witnessed what Linda had built. The formal evaluation process became secondary to the obvious evidence of genuine community happening around her. Tables full of people from different backgrounds, ages, and circumstances, all engaged in animated conversation, children playing together while their parents formed new friendships. Elderly participants sharing stories with college students who listened with genuine interest. During dessert, Linda stood up to make the announcements that had become a beloved tradition at community tables events. She recognized volunteers who'd gone above and beyond, celebrated community members who'd achieved personal milestones, and invited people to share information about other local resources and opportunities. Before we close tonight, I want to acknowledge someone who's taught all of us a lot about what it means to use unexpected opportunities responsibly, Linda said, looking in my direction. 6 months ago, Maya Hartwell had a moment of viral fame that she could have turned into personal profit. Instead, she chose to use that attention to support work that was already happening in communities across the country. Her partnership with Community Tables shows what's possible when people choose collaboration over competition, when they choose to amplify existing solutions rather than assuming they need to invent new ones. The applause that followed felt different from the recognition I'd received during my brief period of internet celebrity. This wasn't about my individual story or my personal inspiration. It was about choosing to become part of something larger and more sustainable than any single person's moment of inspiration could create. After the guests left and the cleanup was finished, Dr. Wells approached me with her final questions. Miss Hartwell, I have to ask, do you ever regret not capitalizing on your viral moment? You could have built a significant personal platform, written books, developed your own programs. Instead, you've essentially made yourself a supporting character in someone else's story. I thought about Richard Blackwood's contracts, about the speaking fees and book deals I'd declined, about the personal brand I could have built around my Christmas dinner story. Well, 6 months ago, I thought my story was about a lonely woman who invited strangers to dinner and accidentally became famous. But I've learned that was never really my story at all. My story is about someone who was lost and isolated until she found her way into meaningful work that was already happening. Linda Patterson didn't need me to succeed. Community Tables was already successful. But I needed Community Tables to become who I was supposed to be. And who is that? Someone who builds bridges between people who need each other but don't yet know how to find each other. Someone who takes whatever unexpected resources come her way and invests them in work that will continue long after anyone remembers her name. Dr. Wells closed her notebook and extended her hand. Miss Hartwell, I came here expecting to evaluate a program for potential replication. Instead, I've seen a model for how individuals can use temporary attention to create lasting change. The National Institute will be recommending Community Tables for our largest community development grant. But more importantly, we'll be highlighting your partnership with Linda as an example of how viral moments can be transformed into sustainable community building. 3 weeks later, the grant announcement came through. $2 million over 5 years to expand community tables into 50 cities across the United States, with additional funding for training programs that would teach other community organizers how to replicate Linda's methodology. I was in my new apartment in Sacramento, finally living in a space large enough for the dinner parties I'd started hosting monthly, when Linda called with the news. Maya, we did it. National funding, coast-to-coast expansion, everything we dreamed about when you first proposed this partnership. You did it, Linda. You spent 12 years building something so solid that it could support this kind of growth. I just helped connect your work to some unexpected opportunities. No, we did it together. And more importantly, we did it in a way that honors what community tables has always been about. This isn't about either of our individual recognition, it's about creating a model that other communities can adapt to their own needs. After we hung up, I sat in my living room looking at the framed photo from my original Christmas dinner. 15 strangers gathered around my tiny table, all of us tentative and hopeful, none of us knowing that we were participating in something that would eventually touch thousands of lives across multiple states. But the real transformation wasn't measured in program expansion or media coverage or grant funding. It was measured in the letters I received from people like Frank, who wrote that community tables had given him a reason to look forward to each week instead of just enduring it. It was evident in Sarah's evolution from a shy newcomer to a confident community organizer who was starting her own chapter in Portland. It was visible in Keisha's children, who now understood that community was something you actively created rather than something that either existed or didn't. Mrs. Rodriguez had been right when she'd written that I was someone who built bridges between people. But what I'd learned was that the most important bridges weren't the ones I constructed from scratch. They were the ones I helped strengthen and expand, the ones that connected my small moment of inspiration to networks of care and support that had been developing for years before I arrived on the scene. The journal she'd given me was full now, documenting not just my personal transformation but the evolution of community tables from a local Sacramento program to a national model for grassroots community building. The final entry read, "My name is Maya Hartwell, and I used to think my story was about losing everything in a divorce and spending 3 years learning to be invisible. Then I thought it was about accidentally becoming famous for inviting strangers to dinner. But I've learned that my real story is about finding my way into work that was already happening, work that needed additional resources and energy but didn't need me to reinvent it." The 15 strangers who shared my Christmas table gave me more than company for one evening and more than viral fame for one moment. They gave me a glimpse of what I was capable of contributing to the world when I stopped hiding from my own loneliness and started using it as a bridge to connect with other people's need for community. I'm not the founder of community tables. I'm not the originator of community dinners for isolated people. I'm not the creator of any innovative social program. But I'm someone who learned how to recognize good work when I found it, how to use unexpected opportunities to support existing solutions, and how to transform temporary attention into lasting change. The greatest gift of this entire experience has been discovering that individual inspiration only matters when it connects to collective action, that viral moments only create lasting change when they amplify work that was already building sustainable community connections. I spent 3 years thinking I had nothing valuable to offer the world. I've spent the past 6 months learning that everyone has something valuable to offer, but the value comes from finding your place in work that's larger than yourself, not from trying to build something entirely new from your own individual experience. Tomorrow I start training the next group of community tables coordinators, people who will take this model to cities across the country and adapt it to serve their own community's needs. 6 months from now, most of them won't remember my name or my Christmas dinner story. But they'll remember Linda's methodology, and they'll remember that sustainable community building requires patience, consistency, and the humility to learn from people who've been doing this work longer than you have. That's the kind of legacy worth building, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone remembering who you are, only on the work continuing to serve people who need it long after you've moved on to whatever comes next. As I closed the journal and prepared for bed, I realized that the apartment no longer felt empty, even though I lived alone. It felt peaceful in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people physically present and everything to do with knowing that I belonged to a community that extended far beyond these walls. The woman who'd invited 15 strangers to Christmas dinner had been searching for connection. The woman I'd become had found purpose. And the work would continue, creating bridges between strangers who needed each other, long after anyone remembered the viral Christmas story that had accidentally brought us all together. 2 years after the community table's expansion, I stood in the departure lounge at San Francisco International Airport, holding a boarding pass for Geneva and feeling the weight of a decision that would have seemed impossible when I was living above Henderson's Deli. The World Health Organization had invited me to present community as a model for addressing what they were calling a global epidemic of social isolation at their annual conference on community mental health. The invitation had come through Dr. Pemberton's foundation, which had been tracking the mental health outcomes of community tables participants across all 50 cities. The data was remarkable. Participants showed measurable decreases in depression and anxiety, reduced emergency room visits for stress-related conditions, and increased engagement with preventive healthcare services. What had started as a simple response to holiday loneliness had evolved into an evidence-based intervention for social isolation that was being studied by researchers around the world. Linda had insisted I be the one to present our work to the international audience, despite my protests that she was the true architect of everything we'd accomplished. "Maya, you understand something about this work that I'm still learning," she'd said during our last planning meeting. "I know how to run community dinners efficiently and create sustainable programming. But you understand how to communicate why this work matters to people who've never experienced real isolation. That's what the WHO audience needs to hear." As my flight boarded, I thought about the folder in my carry-on bag containing letters from community tables participants across the country. I'd asked each local coordinator to send me stories from people whose lives had been changed by the program, not for the WHO presentation but for my own understanding of what we'd actually created. The letters told stories I never could have imagined when I'd invited 15 strangers to my tiny apartment. There was Margaret from Detroit, an 80-year-old widow who'd been considering assisted suicide before finding community tables and was now mentoring young mothers in her neighborhood.
James from Phoenix, a veteran with PTSD who credited his community tables connections with saving his marriage and helping him return to work. Sophia from Miami, an undocumented immigrant who'd found not just friendship but legal assistance and job training through relationships she'd formed at community dinners. Each story represented a life trajectory that had been altered by something as simple as sharing meals with strangers. But the cumulative impact suggested something more significant, that social isolation wasn't just an individual problem requiring individual solutions, but a public health crisis that could be addressed through systematic community building. The flight to Geneva gave me 12 hours to reflect on how profoundly my understanding of success had changed since my divorce. 3 years ago, success would have meant financial security, professional recognition, and proof that I could rebuild my life independently. Now it meant receiving letters from strangers describing how community tables had helped them find their way back to hope when they'd given up on human connection entirely. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the WHO's Director of Community Mental Health, met me at the airport with the kind of warm professionalism that immediately put me at ease. She was a petite woman in her 50s whose rapid-fire Spanish-accented English barely kept pace with her obviously brilliant mind. "Miss Hartwell, your timing is perfect. We're seeing unprecedented levels of social isolation worldwide, especially among elderly populations in developed countries and displaced populations everywhere. Traditional mental health interventions are failing because they treat isolation as a symptom rather than addressing it as a primary health determinant." During the drive to my hotel, Dr. Vasquez explained the scope of the global isolation crisis. In Japan, there were over 1 million young adults who'd withdrawn completely from social contact. In the United Kingdom, loneliness was considered such a serious health threat that they'd appointed a minister for loneliness. In refugee camps across 3 continents, the breakdown of traditional community structures was creating mental health crises that overwhelmed existing resources. What makes community tables interesting to us is that it's simultaneously low-tech and high-impact.
It doesn't require professional mental health providers or expensive infrastructure, it just requires communities willing to prioritize human connection over efficiency and convenience. The WHO conference was unlike any professional gathering I'd ever attended. The audience included public health officials from 60 countries, researchers studying everything from urban planning to neuroscience, and practitioners working on the front lines of community mental health. My presentation was scheduled for the second day, giving me time to attend sessions that expanded my understanding of how isolation manifested differently across cultures and economic systems. Dr. Yuki Tanaka from Tokyo presented research on hikikomori, the phenomenon of young adults who retreated to their bedrooms for months or years, surviving on food delivered by family members and interacting with the world only through internet connections. Her data showed that traditional therapy was largely ineffective because the isolation itself had become a form of protection against a society that felt overwhelmingly demanding and judgmental. The solution cannot be to force isolated individuals back into the same social systems that drove them to withdraw. Dr. Tanaka explained, "We need to create alternative forms of community that feel safe enough for people to risk human connection again." Professor Marie Dubois from Marseille described her work with elderly immigrants who'd maintained strong family connections in their countries of origin but struggled to form meaningful relationships in their adopted communities. Language barriers, cultural differences, and age discrimination created compound isolation that traditional integration programs couldn't address. What we've learned is that cultural bridging requires more than translation services or ethnic community centers. Professor Dubois said, "It requires structured opportunities for people to discover their common humanity across difference." Food is often the most effective bridge because it allows people to share something essential about themselves without requiring complex verbal communication. Dr. James Mitchell from London presented alarming statistics about isolation among young professionals in major cities worldwide. Despite being surrounded by millions of people and having extensive online social networks, this demographic showed rates of loneliness that rivaled those of elderly people in rural areas. Digital connection is creating an illusion of community while actually reducing people's capacity for the kind of sustained vulnerable interaction that builds genuine relationships. Dr. Mitchell argued, "We're seeing an entire generation that's socially skilled in superficial ways but completely unprepared for the emotional intimacy that combats isolation." Each presentation reinforced my growing understanding that community tables had succeeded not because it was innovative, but because it addressed fundamental human needs that modern society had systematically undermined. The program worked because it was based on principles that transcended cultural and economic differences, that people need to feel useful to each other, that vulnerability, shared in safe contexts, builds trust, and that regular, predictable opportunities for connection are essential for mental health. The evening before my presentation, Dr. Vasquez invited me to dinner with several other conference participants. The conversation that followed challenged every assumption I'd made about the universality of community-building approaches. Dr. Amara Okafor from Lagos described her attempts to adapt community tables methodology in Nigerian urban slums, where food scarcity made shared meals impractical and where community spaces were often controlled by competing political or religious factions. The underlying principles work beautifully. Dr. Okafor explained, "People desperately need connection and mutual support. But the specific mechanisms have to be completely different. We've had success with skill-sharing circles where people teach each other practical abilities, and with childcare cooperatives that allow parents to form relationships while addressing concrete needs." Dr. Hassan El-Rahman from Damascus talked about working with Syrian refugees in Jordan, where trauma and displacement created additional barriers to community building. Traditional community structures had been destroyed by war, and people were understandably suspicious of gathering in large groups or trusting strangers with personal information. What we've learned is that community building with traumatized populations requires much slower relationship development and much more attention to safety and autonomy. But the fundamental human need for belonging is so strong that even very damaged people will risk connection when they feel genuinely safe and valued. These conversations forced me to confront the limitations of my own experience.
Community tables had succeeded in American cities with participants who shared certain basic assumptions about safety, voluntary participation, and the possibility of trusting strangers. But the core human needs the program addressed were universal, even when the specific methods required radical adaptation. My presentation the next morning focused on this tension between universal principles and culturally specific implementation. I shared the story of my Christmas dinner, not as a model to be replicated exactly, but as an example of how personal vulnerability could catalyze community formation when combined with systematic follow-through and relationship building. The key insight from community tables isn't that community dinners solve isolation, I told the audience. It's that structured opportunities for strangers to discover their mutual humanity can interrupt the cycles of withdrawal and disconnection that characterize modern loneliness. But those opportunities have to be designed to fit the specific needs, resources, and cultural contexts of particular communities. I presented Linda's methodology for sustainable program development, starting small with highly committed participants. Building trust through consistent follow-through, expanding gradually based on community feedback, and always prioritizing relationship building over service delivery or program metrics. The most important thing we've learned is that community building cannot be professionalized in ways that remove control from community members themselves. The moment these programs become services delivered by experts to passive recipients, they lose their power to address isolation. People need to feel useful to each other, not just helped by each other. The response to my presentation was overwhelming. During the question period, participants described similar initiatives in their own countries and asked detailed questions about training, funding, and evaluation. Several asked for permission to adapt community tables materials for their specific contexts. But the conversation that mattered most happened during the coffee break, when a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Miss Hartwell, my name is Dr. Lisa Chen, and I'm a researcher studying isolation among elderly Chinese immigrants in Vancouver. My grandmother died last year, and I know she was desperately lonely in her final months despite living with our family. She spoke very little English and felt like a burden because she couldn't contribute to household activities she'd always managed in China. Your presentation made me realize that what she needed wasn't just family care, but opportunities to feel useful and valued by people outside our family. I want to start a community tables program specifically for elderly immigrants, where they can teach traditional cooking and crafts while building relationships with people from different backgrounds." Dr. Chen's response crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate about why community tables worked when other well-intentioned programs failed. It wasn't just about bringing people together. It was about creating contexts where people could experience themselves as valuable contributors to others' well-being, not just recipients of care or charity. The remainder of the conference blurred past in a series of intense conversations with researchers and practitioners who wanted to collaborate on expanding community-building approaches globally. Dr. Vasquez arranged for me to meet with officials from the European Union who were developing continent-wide strategies for addressing social isolation among aging populations. Representatives from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees asked about adapting community tables principles for displaced populations worldwide. By the final day, I felt simultaneously energized and overwhelmed. The scope of potential collaboration was far beyond anything I'd imagined when Linda and I had first partnered to expand community tables beyond Sacramento. The work was evolving from a regional program to a global movement, with implications I was only beginning to understand. Dr. Vasquez walked me to the airport, continuing our conversation about next steps until the final boarding call. "Maya, what you've accomplished with community tables represents a fundamental shift in how we think about addressing isolation. Instead of treating it as an individual pathology requiring professional intervention, you've demonstrated that it's a community problem requiring community solutions." The WHO wants to support the development of a global network of community-building practitioners who can adapt these principles to local contexts worldwide. Dr. Vasquez, I'm honored by the interest, but I need to be clear about something. I'm not the expert here. Linda Patterson developed the methodology that actually works. Local coordinators in 50 cities have adapted it to serve their community's specific needs. The people who attend community tables dinners are the ones who make it effective by choosing to trust strangers with their vulnerability. My role has been connecting resources to work that was already succeeding. Exactly. That's why we want to work with you. You understand that sustainable community building requires distributing leadership rather than centralizing it. The global network we're envisioning wouldn't be controlled by any single organization or individual. It would be a collaborative platform for sharing resources, training, and adaptations across cultural and national boundaries. The flight home gave me time to process not just the conference conversations but the trajectory my life had taken since that Christmas Eve when I'd opened my door to 15 strangers. The woman who'd felt invisible and worthless 3 years ago was returning from Geneva with commitments to help develop community building programs on multiple continents. But the transformation felt sustainable in a way that viral fame never could have, because it was grounded in work that would continue regardless of my individual involvement. Community tables existed in 50 cities not because of my personal story, but because Linda had developed a methodology that could be learned and adapted by others. The global expansion would succeed not because of any individual leader, but because the fundamental human needs it addressed were universal. When I landed in San Francisco, Linda was waiting at the airport with Frank, Sarah, and several other community tables veterans who'd become close friends over the past 2 years. Their presence reminded me that whatever international collaborations might develop, the heart of this work would always be local relationships between people who'd chosen to show up for each other consistently. How did it go? Linda asked as we drove back towards Sacramento. It went well, but Linda, we need to talk about what comes next. The WHO wants to support global expansion, and there are opportunities for funding and collaboration that could reach millions of people. But all of that only works if we can maintain the principles that make community tables effective at the local level. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we need to develop a training program that teaches people not just how to organize community dinners, but how to build sustainable networks of mutual support that can adapt to any cultural context. I'm thinking we need to create resources that help communities assess their own needs and develop their own solutions rather than implementing our model exactly. Frank, who'd been quietly listening from the back seat, spoke up. Maya, can I ask you something? With all these international opportunities, are you going to keep living in Sacramento? Are you going to stay involved with our local community tables? His question touched on something I'd been avoiding thinking about during the intensity of the conference. The global opportunities were exciting and meaningful, but they were also abstract in ways that local community building never was. I could influence policy and training programs from anywhere in the world, but I could only build genuine relationships with specific people in specific places. Frank, I'm not going anywhere. The international work matters, but only if it supports what we're doing here and in places like this everywhere. The moment it becomes more important than local relationships, it stops being community building and becomes something else entirely. Sarah laughed from the passenger seat. Good, because we're planning your birthday party next month, and it would be really awkward if you weren't there. The casual mention of my birthday party reminded me that I now had people in my life who remembered personal details and made plans that included me not because I was useful to their professional goals, but simply because they enjoyed my company. That kind of ordinary, reliable friendship had seemed impossible 3 years ago, but it had grown naturally from the community connections that started with my Christmas dinner. Over the following months, we developed what became known as the Community Tables Global Learning Network, a collaborative platform that supported community building initiatives worldwide while maintaining local autonomy and cultural responsiveness. The network provided training resources, funding connections, and communication tools that allowed practitioners to share strategies and adaptations across geographic and cultural boundaries. But the most important innovation was insisting that every new program be developed and led by people from the communities they served, rather than by outside experts or organizations. The network's role was to provide resources and support, not to control or standardize community building approaches. Dr. Chen started her program for elderly Chinese immigrants in Vancouver, where participants taught traditional cooking while sharing stories and building relationships with younger community members learning about their cultural heritage. Okafor's skill-sharing circles in Lagos evolved into informal economic cooperatives that provided both social connection and income generation for participants. Dr. Al-Rahman's trauma-informed community building in Jordan became a model for refugee camp programming worldwide. Each adaptation reinforced the core insight that had emerged from my original Christmas dinner, that isolation could be addressed most effectively by creating structured opportunities for people to discover their value to each other, but that those opportunities had to be designed by and for the specific communities they served. My role evolved into something I'd never expected. I became a translator between local community builders and international organizations that wanted to support their work. I spent half my time visiting community tables programs around the world, learning from local coordinators and participants about what worked in their specific contexts. The other half was spent in meetings with funders, policymakers, and researchers, helping them understand how to support community building without controlling or undermining it. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying in ways my previous career had never been. Instead of feeling like I was building something from nothing, I felt like I was helping connect existing solutions to additional resources and opportunities. Instead of trying to convince people that community building mattered, I was working with people who already understood its importance and needed practical support to expand their efforts. 3 years after the Geneva conference, I received a letter that brought everything full circle. It was from Elena Rodriguez, Mrs. Rodriguez's granddaughter, who'd brought me that first mysterious gift on Christmas night. "Dear Maya," she wrote, "I wanted you to know that my grandmother passed away peacefully last month, surrounded by family and friends who'd been touched by her generosity over many years. In her final weeks, she talked often about the Christmas dinner that changed your life and about how proud she was to have recognized your potential when you couldn't see it yourself. She asked me to tell you that watching you grow into your purpose was one of the great joys of her later years. She said you'd learned the most important lesson she could teach, that individual success means nothing unless it creates opportunities for others to discover their own strength and purpose." Mrs. Rodriguez's death hit me harder than I'd expected. She'd been the first person to see past my brokenness to the community builder I was capable of becoming. Her gift of $50,000 had been less important than her gift of belief in my potential when I had none myself. But her granddaughter's letter also contained news that connected Mrs. Rodriguez's legacy to the ongoing work of community building. Elena had used her inheritance to establish the Rodriguez Foundation for Community Connection, which would provide seed funding for community building initiatives led by people who'd experienced isolation themselves. Abuela always said that the people who've been most broken by loneliness are often the ones who understand most clearly how to help others find their way back to community. Elena explained, "The foundation will specifically support projects led by formerly isolated individuals who want to create the kinds of connections they wished they'd had during their darkest periods." The foundation's first grant went to Margaret from Detroit, the 80-year-old widow who'd found community tables after contemplating suicide and had become a mentor to young mothers in her neighborhood. She used the funding to start an intergenerational program pairing elderly community members with overwhelmed parents, creating mutual support systems that addressed isolation across age groups. Standing in Mrs. Rodriguez's community center at the foundation's launch event, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by community building initiatives around the world, I felt the deep satisfaction of work that had grown far beyond my individual contribution while remaining grounded in the relationships that had made it possible. The woman who'd invited 15 strangers to Christmas dinner out of loneliness had become someone whose life was so filled with meaningful connections that solitude felt like a choice rather than a burden. But more importantly, thousands of other people had discovered their own capacity to transform isolation into community, one relationship at a time. The work would continue, spreading through networks of trust and mutual care that no individual or organization could control or destroy. That was its greatest strength. It belonged to everyone who participated in it, and its success depended not on any single leader but on the universal human need for belonging and the courage to create connection where none existed before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.